Did you know that in South Africa, it remains the most affected by HIV and AIDS? In 2008, 5.2 million people were living with HIV. Let me tell you about Zimbabwe. It has the highest number of orphans in proportion to its population than any other country in the world. Most of these cases are results of parents dying from AIDS. In a country with such a tense political and social climate, it has been difficult to respond to the crisis. Let me tell you about Kenya. There's an estimated 1.9 million orphans living with HIV and AIDS in Kenya. It is the country's single biggest health issue and challenge. They've had to face so many major challenges in Kenya, ranging from child labor, harmful traditional practices like forced early marriage, and can you believe genital mutilation, poor access to education and health care, and a lack of protection from many different types of abuse. These issues are overwhelming. All we can do is focus on one child at a time. Hello, my name is Maureen Ahern. I work with an organization called Our Journey, Inc. Our Journey began many years ago. I was working at a private exclusive island, Little St. Simon's Island, as the general manager. Many guests would visit and say, "Where do you go, Maureen, after a job like this?" And my answer was always, "I have a dream." I'm not a doctor, I'm not a teacher, I'm not a nurse. I always wanted to hold orphans in the African countries that were just dying in the streets of AIDS. So I very naively left my job in 2003 to pursue this dream. Well, it took until 2004 before an organization in South Africa, an orphanage, would finally let me come for a year to stay with them and do volunteer work. But after staying at that orphanage for a year, I soon realized it was the children that made it to that orphanage that were the fortunate ones. The ones that lived in the tribunal communities nearby, they weren't so fortunate. They didn't have a meal a day or one place at night to put their head. So I had decided after that year, and with a lot of help from a lot of people, that we would have our journey and it would become everyone else's journey besides mine. That was the only way we could succeed. And we created, with the help of a lot of people, a nonprofit, a 501c3, and that is how Our Journey came about, and how we came about to be working in 3 different countries. Our Journey's vision is to empower rural women to take up for their own and to help break the cycle of dependency. And we have many projects that help them do this. One of the special needs identified by these women was the growing need and number of orphan children in desperate need of food, clothing, and proper living conditions. And because of that, we come up with essential projects now in progress in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Kenya. We do this by building their capacities, both economically and socially, as we seek to promote their livelihoods through self-help projects. One of the most social needs identified by these women was the need of food and clothing and school uniforms. I'd like to share with you some of the essential projects that are now in progress in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Kenya. The first essential project we had to start with was food. They couldn't go to school hungry. They weren't able to make that 4 or 5 mile walk. So after visiting the school 2 years ago, we targeted 100 orphans that we were going to try to feed. Little did we know that the whole school, the 500 children, were all vulnerable, not just the 100 that we had chosen. So that had to be fixed. And I'm happy to tell you the local women worked with us, and they empowered themselves to get a garden running that would help supplement the feeding program, so that in turn enabled us to feed the whole school, 500 children. It went from 100 to 500 in no time at all through the work of these local women. I mean, they have no means whatsoever of making any money, of having any support. So once I knew I was working with women that were willing to help themselves, Our Journey decided that we would come up with the money and find support to get a garden going. And from that point on, I'm telling those women, they ran with that program. They put a metal fence up, a barbed wire fence. They have children walking on weekends to school because the water only comes from a pump that takes about 10 children to pump the water to the garden and carry it in buckets. So they have assigned children that will come on weekends and holidays. They themselves come. And because of that, these adults are also working for food, and they're able to take some of the surplus home to feed their families. I mean, can you imagine? Some of these women have 15 to 20 orphans living with them. HIV is killing children and women and wiping out the mothers and fathers that would normally take care of these children. It is now grandmothers that they call go-go's that are just like me, that are caring for all these orphans in their home. In helping to establish the feeding project, that was just one step. The next step had to be the children had to be warm when they're at home. Like I said, they're walking to school. It just opened up many, many doors for other things that were dire needs that we take for granted that they didn't have. One of the other essential projects that Our Journey is involved in is the blanket project. And that's kind of self-explanatory. A blanket keeps us warm. But remember, these children are living in mud huts and they're sleeping on a dirt floor. Can you imagine a rainy day and they have long rainy seasons? They're sleeping on mud, and many of these children are very, very sick. Some of them already are HIV positive. Well, this year we were able to give out a blanket to every child at that school, and the village people that were willing to help implement the garden program and feed those children. So the blanket is very, very essential to their life. It will help them feel better and maybe get them well enough that they can go back to school. And with that, we have the home-based care that we sponsor. We sponsor training for local women to learn the basic necessities of caring for people in these huts. And some of them is to just be able to help them die with dignity. So the blanket project is all-encompassing. It hits many different facets of how they live. Now that we have the first two essentials covered, food and comfort, we need to be thinking about education. The children have to get to school. Did you know that for most areas in Africa, a school uniform is required, and that is almost next to impossible for most of these families. And that is where Our Journey comes in. We try to supply school uniforms for the very vulnerable and needy, mainly orphans, but there's also very many vulnerable children that fall into that same category. We have in the past year supplied probably over 400 uniforms and will continue. And I'd like to share with you one situation in particular that I encountered this year in Zimbabwe. It's a school where we are doing the blanket project and the feeding project and the community garden. It's working very, very well. But I found out that only 7% of the 7th graders go on to high school. They don't pass the test. I was absolutely astonished, thinking 7%, that's 7 out of 100 children, are able to go on to high school and the rest don't. Well, in the past, I can see the reasons for that. They didn't have the essentials, the food, the blankets. Well, Our Journey is going to try to provide these essentials so that they do pass, and we're challenging the school teachers in the system and the principal that 7% must be higher. The kids are now coming to school because they're fed and they're warm. Now let's teach them and let them be able to go on to high school. And as an incentive, Our Journey has committed to the school, any child that passes that test, Our Journey will outfit them with a school uniform and school supplies. Our future is for Our Journey to stay committed to breaking the cycle of dependency. Our dream is already become a reality. It can also become your story by joining Our Journey.